going to be looking at the book The Anatomy of Fascism by Robert O. Paxton. He was a Mellon Professor Emeritus at Columbia University. And in this book, Robert does a really great deep dive into the inner workings of fascism, the characteristics of fascism, into a brief kind of definition of fascism, but more so into identifying the ways that it operated as a means of identifying it. First, we'll start with what Robert Paxton describes as the 5 stages of fascism. Number 1 is the creation of movements. Number 2 is the rooting in political systems. Number 3 is the seizure of power. Number 4 is the exercise of power. And number 5 is characterized by a long duration of either radicalization or of entropy. Some of the important themes that I thought were worth picking up from this book was noting how little ideology and theory plays into fascism. Theory always came second to action. Ideology was more or less fluid, depending on how much it needed to adapt to appeal to more people or to conservative governments in power. On page 17, it describes how Mussolini was quoted in May of 1920 as saying, quote, "Do not feel tied to any particular doctrinal form." Another important thing that I noticed in this book that I thought was worth noting is how important parallel structures were to the rise of fascist movements. So for anyone who doesn't know what parallel structures means in this context, is essentially going to be building up institutions that mirror current political institutions in order that they might take over the duties of those already entrenched political systems, in order to kind of like make the old form useless and get it out of the way to install your fascist form. Fascism oftentimes will try to paint itself as a mass politic as opposed to the standard liberal politics, operating in a quote-unquote third positionist nature that differs from traditional conservative dictatorships. Fascism operates as a mass political line at the birth of mass movements from the left, filling gaps traditional liberal democracies seemed unable to solve. Fascism thrives in liberal democratic gridlock. That is to say, when traditional liberal democratic institutions come to a standstill for one reason or another, fascism tends to rise in power. But Robert makes it clear in this book that fascism, quote-unquote, exploits that opening, but it is not the sole cause of it. From page 117. From page 106, he says, quote, "However we interpret the deadlock of democratic government, no fascist movement is likely to reach office without it." Another point that I thought was really interesting is how he says, quote, in page 111, "In general, well-entrenched conservative regimes of all sorts have provided unfavorable terrain for fascism to reach power." And I found that really interesting because we normally associate, conservative regimes with fascist regimes. And so at first I found that really odd. But when I started to look more into it when reading further, it comes out that this is due less to the conservatives opposing the fascists, but that traditional conservative regimes often are doing a good enough job suppressing the left without having to ask for the help of overt fascist partnerships. The status quo ends up not being sufficiently threatened enough by the left to require fascist collaboration. But when it does, that collaboration often leads to the fascists gaining footholds in places of power. Another point, kind of in the same vein here, is how an important step towards normalization of fascist activities was convincing right-wing governments in power to accept the violence that the fascists instituted as necessary to save conservatives from a left threat. So while conservatives would rather not work with fascists if they don't have to because it's destabilizing, they'll take that destabilization any day over the destabilization that they see as coming from the left. As left movements rise, right movements also rise in reaction. Another portion of this that I found really interesting kind of challenges the standard orthodox Marxist understanding of the capitalist class's relation to Adolf Hitler and his rise. Oftentimes in orthodox Marxist circles, you'll hear essentially that the business people in Nazi Germany helped Hitler rise to power because it would help their businesses. And as it turns out, things are a bit more complex than that when we really look into it. Orthodox Marxists tend to overplay the importance of the capitalist class collaboration with the fascists, when in reality they were much more likely to put their funding towards traditional conservative dictatorship, because fascist destabilization proved less favorable for stable businesses. Here's some quotes from the text to support that. From page 66, quote, "Close scrutiny of business archives shows that most German businessmen hedged their bets, contributing to all the non-socialist electoral formations that showed any signs of success at keeping the Marxists out of power. They always contributed more to traditional conservatives." Page 100, quote, "Business contributions did not become a major resource of Hitler until after he attained power." Page 145. Peter Hayes put it succinctly, quote, "The Nazi regime and business had converging but not identical interests." And on page 118 says, quote, "Political elites make choices that might not be their first preferences. They proceed from choice to choice along a path of narrowing options. At each fork in the road, they choose the anti-socialist solution." End quote, from page 118. And looking at that last quote there, it's in making those narrowing choices, as the choices narrow further and further, that you eventually find yourself just supporting overt fascism with no caveats. On the other end of the spectrum, an overimportance of emphasis being put on the anti-capitalist rhetoric of the fascist as a means of gaining followers is often employed to paint the fascists as much more overtly socialist in nature than they really were. On page 53 he says, quote, "Concentrating on origins puts misleading emphasis on early fascism's anti-bourgeois rhetoric and its critique of capitalism." I'm not quite sure where he says this in the book, but I know he eventually says about how, let's see, I've got it here, page 141, quote, "Although fascist regimes did indeed make some breathtaking changes, they left the distribution of property and the economic and social hierarchy largely intact." And I think that's important to remember. On the flip side of the standard orthodox Marxist argument about the rise of fascism is that anyone who wants to tell you that the Nazis were socialist, or they were basically communist, is just wrong. They're purposefully misattributing those early rhetorical underpinnings with how the broader movement actually operated. They pretty much never did anything to change the distribution of property or alter the economic or social hierarchy. Another really brief point that I want to touch on that I found interesting that I want to learn more about moving forward is the concept of occupation fascisms. The two examples of which he provides are Vichy France and fascist Croatia. On page 114, he says, quote, "It is doubtful that we can call them authentic fascisms, if only because they are not free to pursue national grandeur and expansionism." He doesn't talk a whole lot about occupation fascisms in this book, but I do know he has written, I believe, 2 different books about Vichy France that might get more into that I'd like to know more about how specifically occupation fascisms operate. But I do know throughout this book he mentions, like he says, quote, on page 20, "Fascism, unlike other isms, is not for export." And what he means by that is that, like in these countries that Nazi Germany ended up invading, in places where it took power, it didn't institute any kind of fascism in that country that benefited that country, that gave that country a national identity to be fascist around. It merely gave it a fascism that operated solely as a satellite of Germany, which is interesting. I thought. Another quote that I found really interesting was, quote, on page 20, "It has proved impossible to make any fascist, quote-unquote, international work." And that's because fascisms don't tend to play nice together. And how could they? They're vying for the same materials. It's a zero-sum game. They can't both be the greatest nation. That's one thing in the nature of fascism that I think is only beneficial to its opponents. Next, I'm going to talk about just a couple things he mentions regarding the Holocaust that I thought were worth noting. Obviously, we probably don't need much of a refresher on the phases of the Holocaust per se, but I thought it was worth noting how the first phase was segregation. The next phase was expulsion. The Nazis had planned to move much of the Jewish population to the mountains in Russia while they were invading for Operation Barbarossa, but that was frustrated by Soviet forces, and so they had to move to what they called the quote-unquote final solution, which was just flat-out extermination. From page 162, quote, "The failure of all the quote-unquote intermediary solutions helped open the way for a quote-unquote final solution, extermination." The other thing I wanted to mention that I thought was worth noting surrounding the Holocaust was that there were 2 developments that helped to ready perpetrators to kill any and all Jews. One being a quote-unquote series of dress rehearsals, starting with the T4 program killing of the quote incurably ill and insane Germans, page 161, with the second dress rehearsal being the Einsatzgruppen, who were squads tasked with quote-unquote executing the political and cultural elite of invaded countries, page 162. A third quote-unquote dress rehearsal was the intentional death of millions of Soviet prisoners of war, end quote, page 162. Quote, "The second category of development that helped prepare a quote-unquote willingness to murder consisted of blockages, emergencies, and crises that made the Jews become a seemingly unbearable burden to the administration of occupied territories, page 162. Now, what are some of the differences between a traditional conservative authoritarianism or dictatorship and a classical fascism dictatorship? While that may seem like a minute detail, I think it's worth exploring, and so does Robert Paxton. I think this more comes into play when doing analysis such as figuring out if a figure like Donald Trump is fascist, which we'll get into just after this, through an article written also by Robert Paxton called American Duce, about the comparison of Donald Trump with fascists. conservatives less often than fascists seek overt military imperialism and expansionism. They prefer a stable conservative society to one that has been destabilized by fascists. However, conservatives are more than willing to use fascists as a weapon, which in the process often opens doors for the opportunity for power for the fascists. On page 11, Robert says, quote, "One cannot consider fascism simply a more muscular form of conservatism." And on page 98 says, "Although conservatives might accept violence against the socialists and trade unionists, they would not tolerate it against the state." Now, moving away from the book review of specifically the Anatomy of Fascism, let's look at a brief couple of paragraphs from another one of Robert Paxton's works, an article he wrote titled American Duce. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from it that I think are worth noting. And I might end up reading this in full in a future video. I'm not certain yet. But here we go. Quote, "Here is where Trump and the Republicans part ways with their putative predecessors. Our current president and his advisors would never consider establishing a corporatist economy. They want as much liberty in the marketplace as suits their own agenda. They want to subordinate community interests to individual interests, at least those of the wealthy individuals. Trump's electoral campaign appealed successfully to the bitterness of the unskilled white working class, which feels itself both economically and culturally besieged. Here, arguably, there is some overlap between Trump and the fascists. The Nazis, too, denounced the social and cultural experiments of Weimar. But unlike the fascists, Trump seeks no territorial gains, focusing instead on excluding immigrants and the symbolic sealing of the Mexican border. In the event of a terrorist act within the United States, he could well impose martial law and stop the functioning of democratic institutions in this country. Are we therefore looking at a fascist? Not really. Unchecked executive power indicates generic dictatorship rather than fascism in particular, and affixing the label to Trump actually confuses matters, obscuring his economic and social libertarianism. We might as well call the Trump regime by the appropriate name, plutocracy." And that's going to do it for those couple of sections from American Duce. I hope you enjoyed all of this. It's a really great read, The Anatomy of Fascism. I'd recommend you pick it up, and I'd also recommend maybe reading that full American Duce article by Robert. His works seem really great, and I look forward to reading more of his work. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for joining us. Like and subscribe down below if you want more content in the future. Otherwise, you just have a great rest of your day. Take care.